Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world and inspiring future creators. For all those that like great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your health, aging, and longevity ambassador along for this journey. So on several recent shows, we've been spending a lot of time on different topics pertaining to human health, disease, degeneration, and aging, focusing on a variety of the therapeutic and preventative technologies that are being developed in the private and public sectors of the economy, both here in the US and abroad. Some on the cutting edge, some a little more on the bleeding edge, and some on the sounds like science fiction edge. And while many of these technologies hold amazing promise for the future improvement of the human condition with their respective applications, many ethical related questions arise that we must always take the time to be aware of and, of course, be open to dialogue in relation to. Bioethics is broadly defined as the study of ethical issues emerging from advances in biology and medicine, and is concerned with the questions that arise from the combinatorial relationships among life sciences, biotech, medicine, politics, law, theology, and philosophy. So today's guest, who I'm extremely excited about, who's going to talk for us a while about this topic, and really drill down in regards to various categories of emerging technologies, is Dr. David Magnus. Dr. Magnus is the Thomas A. Raffin Professor of Medicine and Biomedical Ethics and Professor of Pediatrics at Stanford University, where he directs the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. Dr. Magnus received his PhD in philosophy from Stanford and currently co-chairs Stanford Hospital and Clinic's Ethics Committee, which provides consultation to doctors, patients, and families on issues concerning surrogate decision-making at the end of life and organ donation. He's a member of Stanford's End-of-Life Work Group, Palliative Care Board, and the newly formed Innovative Care Committee. In addition to this, Dr. Magnus has spearheaded ethics training programs offered to the medical students and clinicians at Stanford. He serves as the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Bioethics and is widely published on a range of topics, including brain death, organ transplantation, stem cells, healthcare reform, research ethics, end-of-life care, and genetic technologies. He's published journals including the New England Journal of Medicine, Science, Hastings Center Report, Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics, and the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. Dr. Magnus served on the National Research Council Ad Hoc Committee on the Bioconfinement of Genetically Engineered Organisms and on the California Human Stem Cell Research Advisory Committee. He's consulted both for the World Bank on food security and biotechnology and the National Conference of State Legislators on cloning. And he's also currently the vice chair of the IRB for the New Precision Medicine Initiative, all of us, NIH. Along with all his scholarly work, he has written an extensive amount of editorial pieces in many prominent newspapers, Time Magazine, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, and so forth. And he's appeared on numerous television shows, Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, Fox News, and so forth. In addition, he has served as president of the American Bioethics Program Directors, which represents a leadership of 60 academic bioethics programs all across North America. Wow. A lot happening. So with all that being said, Dr. Magnus, thank you so much for joining us for a little while today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being here. So, we typically just start off by, introducing the audience to you, giving you the floor so we can hear a little bit about you, your background, where you grew up, how you got interested in philosophy, and ultimately how you got interested in this really emerging and exciting area of bioethics.
Yeah, sure. In a way, philosophy is the family business. My father was a philosophy professor. He was a Nietzsche scholar. I've been, grew up being aware of philosophy as a field, reading philosophy. I started off as an undergraduate actually in physics. Mm-hmm. The siren call of philosophy sort of lured me away. And when I was a graduate student, I was really torn between two different areas of research. One, I was very interested in science. And so I was interested in history and philosophy of science. In particular, I wanted focusing on biology. And in fact, my dissertation focused on some issues in history and philosophy of biology. But I was also very interested in ethics. And my first articles I published when I was a grad student was in ethics. So I was sort of torn between those two fields. So it's not surprising that I wound up combining those two into bioethics, although I'd never heard of that when I was a grad student. student, and it was pre Dolly, so bioethics was not quite as omnipresent in the way that it is today in the public imagination. And so I started off as just a philosophy professor, teaching both history and philosophy of science issues, actually doing some stuff related to language, philosophy of language, and then also issues in ethics. And I was doing all those different things. As I started working more and more, the real hook for me was genetic technologies. I started working on ethical and social issues in genetic technology. That started moving me more and more in the medical direction. And then the big jump was when I stopped being a professor of philosophy and went to be a professor in a school of medicine that was University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I was the grad studies director there and helping Art Kaplan, who was there then, run the Bioethics Center at Penn in Philly. And that was a great experience because I had to know some biology to do philosophy of biology, but I didn't really know a lot about medicine. And so the folks at Penn were nice enough to let me essentially go through a lot of what medical students go through and shadow the ICUs and really shadow different services, sit in on transplant listing meetings, and really start to learn some basic medicine in order to be able to think about it. And then I started writing about that. And then over time, by now, that was a long time ago. So I've been at Stanford now for over 16 years, and I was at Penn for 6 years before that. So we're talking about 22 years ago. So by now I've been involved in thousands of, either directly or indirectly, in thousands of patient cases, and spent a lot of time sort of learning some of the basics of medicine, learning how to read a chart, understand, be able to sit at interdisciplinary rounds and understand what the heck physicians are saying when they speak in all the acronyms that they use for communicating with each other, and really learning some of that, which then informed learning enough about the basics. And I've really always had the view that ethics should really be ground up, that our work is best when it's informed by what the problems are that are perceived by people on the ground, whether that's researchers who are actively doing research and developing new technologies, or clinicians engaged in clinical practice, seeing what problems emerge in the work that they're doing and then doing research like that. If you'd like, I could give you a couple of examples of that. So one example would be in our pediatric transplant teams were having a lot of very difficult decisions around listing who should get listed for a transplant, especially they were struggling initially with kids with developmental delay. So how profoundly delayed before it would be inappropriate to list them for transplant, or was there no line to be drawn at all? That was enough of a problem or a challenge with different transplant services looking at it differently. Realized there was very limited amount of data about how these things are actually being done, and most of it was very dated. So that wound up launching us down a pathway where we did a huge amount of survey research on transplant listing decisions. How are these decisions being made? We got a grant and brought together a group to try and develop some consensus around how to think about that, some process recommendations. And so that's sort of an example of how we've done that. And we've done that around a lot of different topics. On the research ethics side of things, I would say similar things are arising out of artificial intelligence. So we're spending a lot of time now talking to a lot of colleagues who are developing AI tools, especially in radiology, but in some other areas, and thinking about the ethical challenges and actually making that work is really driving a lot of what we're doing in terms of guidance in that area. And we find the same thing for precision medicine. Sitting on the IRB, I see firsthand what the challenging ethical issues are, and that forms like what research questions we ask and how we go about trying to do things that will actually be helpful to people who are researchers trying to move precision health forward.
Wonderful, wonderful. Before I drill down into some of these specific areas that you no doubt have every day new questions coming up, the specific cases. When it comes to the area of bioethics overall, and I don't know if this is the right word for it, but is the entire field of bioethics fairly standardized in the sense of how the major thought leaders like yourself and Art Kaplan and so forth think about things, or is it much more heterogeneous? I mean, I think of things like obviously in the oncology space, it's a pretty agreed upon thing that tumors and cancer cells are pretty good to kill. But in other areas of biotech, like aging biotechnology, you have 100 different views on what aging is, and there's always battles that are going on at the scientific conferences and so forth. Do bioethicists tend to agree on most stuff when it comes to some of these really complex issues, or is there quite a bit of I don't know, back and forth that typically occurs behind the scene. You ever get in a fight with Art Kaplan about stuff where you're on one side of something versus the other?
Yeah, sometimes. Art's one of my mentors, so we don't disagree as much as we do with other people, but there are definitely fights that go on in our field. I think it's important to distinguish between several different areas of difference. So one is the level of theory, which I think in practice, for those of us who are really addressing very practical issues, I think theoretical differences don't wind up mattering as much. But at the level of broader philosophical theory, there are differences between approaches. I would say some of those philosophical differences come to matter more about debates around, for example, allocation issues. So if you have different theories of justice and different views about justice, that may wind up leading to substantively different views about how you ought to be allocating scarce resources. So for example, just sticking with theories of justice, if you're a utilitarian who thinks that the right thing to do is try to maximize the overall good, and that's what you're trying to do in allocation issues, that usually means producing the most quality adjusted life years that you can produce. And so when you're having debates, you would focus on that. But that's at odds with other conceptions of justice. For example, prioritarianism, which would say we want to really give preferential treatment to those who are worst off, and we're willing to tolerate us not maybe producing the most optimal outcomes in order to benefit the people who need something the most. Those intuitions come out really most clearly when you have, for example, really, really expensive treatments that are life-saving for a small number of people versus something that produces a very modest benefit, but for such large numbers for the same cost, that it will turn out that, doing some hip replacements winds up being higher on the priority list than life-saving chemotherapy or life-saving bone marrow transplants or things like that. And especially if it's at the extreme, kids whose lives might be saved. You might, intuitively people are willing to say, yeah, 10,000 hip replacements versus 5 kids. If you're doing it just on qualities, you might actually come out ahead with 10,000 hip replacements. But many people's intuitions are that, yeah, those 5 kids who are going to die actually should get priority over this what might be a marginal improvement in quality of life, or even a significant improvement in quality of life, but where it's not as significant as the life-saving thing for a smaller number. So people have intuitions that really are not utilitarian around a lot of things, and so there are different other ways of thinking about theories of justice to accommodate those. Another would be the rule of rescue, which would be embodied in that we when we transplant organs, a lot of life-saving organs, we don't actually allocate them to produce the most quality adjusted life years we could. We don't get the most bang for the buck we could with our organs because we give an extra priority to the people who are the sickest, who need it most urgently and are going to die without it. And sometimes that means because they're a bit sicker, the outcomes are not quite as good as they would be if we didn't give it to the people who are sickest. And so we're willing to make some of those trade-offs, but we're only willing to go so far before the numbers get bad enough that we say, okay, so we're always constantly sort of battling. We essentially turn these broader theories into principles that are trading off against each other, like producing utility possible, helping the people who are at the bottom, things like the rule of rescue, egalitarian intuition. So for kidney transplant, a lot of transplants in the early phases, they usually start with more egalitarian principles like first come, first served, doing it on the basis of wait time. So we have all these conflicting intuitions ethically about justice, and there are actually different theoretical frameworks behind all of those things. And so people who are really committed to those frameworks fight about which framework is best. Utilitarians who really are hardcore utilitarians really are advocate for their framework. But for those of us who work on the ground, we tend to turn those broader ethical theories into just principles, and then sort of doing trade-offs in these principles around what the right thing to do is around particular instances of that. But that can still lead to serious differences of opinion where, if there really is that differences in outcome is not as good, how much are you willing, where do you draw that line? That's such a judgment call. And you can imagine different arguments about that. Or also, even if you're a utilitarian, what are all the good versus bad consequences? Some policy changes in the way kidneys are allocated that was meant to produce more quality adjusted life years and get more bang for the buck by giving the organs that are best quality to the people who are likely to live the longest. So you get more matching between donors who are going to live a long time and kidneys that are going to last a long time, and people who are not going to live as long with kidneys that aren't going to last as long. Makes a lot of sense. But then Friedman Ross has raised the question, well, but what if that turns out to disincentivize people who right now are among the population who are most likely to be live donors. So the overall pool goes down as an unintended consequence of the change in policy. So there's lots of debates about things like that. So there's plenty of fighting and debating going on in bioethics, but often it's at that more local level rather than the theoretical level. And then the other big debate is about what methodologies to use. So a lot of what I've just been describing are really more theoretical or very or conceptual arguments and things like that. But figuring out what the role of data collection and what kind of approaches to take to data collection to explore is really important. We know that it matters how patients or research participants look at certain issues if we're going to do things that will bear on them. So, for example, uses of unconsented blood spots. So when newborns when babies are first born in the hospital, when they're newborns, a little bit of blood is taken from them to test things like fetal ketornuria and some other genetic diseases. It's for their own good. It's de facto mandatory in all states. There's a few where it's technically consented to, but even there's almost no opt-out, and in many states there's not even an option. This is something that's mandatory. But in some states, those parents have the right to consent to whether those blood spots are going to be used for research. In other states, they don't. So here in California, parents don't actually consent to the use of those things, and they're available for research. But it turns out by doing it that way, you wind up getting this very valuable repository that's much more demographically representative of the population than you can get in any other way. If you had an opt-in or had consent, we know that if judging from past studies, you're going to lose a lot of poor, illiterate, underrepresented groups in research are going to wind up being underrepresented in those populations, which winds up leading to biased data. So doing it this way gets you much better, richer, more demographically diverse data, which is valuable for research. So here's what we know. We know people say when asked that they want to give consent, and they even want to have opt-in consent. The majority of people want that. And so people, ethicists like me, study those kinds of things. And we surveys to look at that. We also know that people think the research is valuable, especially when they understand it, and they want that research to take place. What's really hard to study, and so there's some interesting debates about the best way to do that, is how to deal with the trade-off between those two. So we know people want consent, and they even want fairly elaborated, very specific consent. But the more elaborated the consent requirements and more specific they are, so that you have, for example, an opt-in, the less valuable the data is for certain purposes. And what we don't know is how people view the trade-off. We know they want this, and we know they want that, but when there's trade-offs between those two, we don't really know how people look at that. And it turns out that's actually very hard to study. And so a lot of us figure out ways of empirically studying that. Not that it determines what the right policy is, but it's one thing to say, if you just say 85% of people want to give opt-in informed consent, it's easy to think, well, then that's really what we should do. But then there's a huge loss because of that. And if it turned out 70% of people, when they really understand, would say, I'm willing to have a less elaborated consent, or even just notification, so that valuable research would go forward, that might bear on what the right policy should be. It doesn't determine it, it's not dispositive, but it might be important data to think about as you're developing what policies ought to be developed in that area. Anyway, that's called empirical ethics, and figuring out ways of collecting empirical data that we then use in our normative work, and figuring out how do we bring the empirical and the normative to bear. That is itself something that's a very contested terrain in ethics.
Gotcha. Fascinating. Fascinating. So as we take this step then into, I sort of, there's so many different areas that you have the opportunity to talk and think about. I thought it'd be a good idea from sort of the emerging technology perspective to put some of these in different baskets for the sake of this conversation, and sort of take a bioethical sort of walk through life, starting out at the beginning. And I obviously don't want you to have to touch on all these topics, but I in this first basket, which I'll say is embryogenesis. We can call it whatever we want, but within this basket that falls on your desk is cloning, both therapeutic and reproductive, embryonic stem cells, germline editing with tools like CRISPR, on down the road to some of these more exotic tools that are being mentioned, like artificial womb technology being developed here in Philly at Children's Hospital, to some of the really creepy stuff that, just last week, this monkey-human chimera work was announced in Japan. When this bag of the beginning of life technologies research falls on your desk, and Fox or CNN or whoever starts calling, what are the core issues in this basket that you choose to evaluate first? I mean, what's of all of these types of things, what is of immediate importance to evaluate as far as is this legitimate research or not? Should this happen? On down to, the more utilitarian stuff.
Right. So first, I would say I would hope in the ideal world, before CNN is calling me, in general, we've really as a field been trying to work hard with the scientific community to move away from what we could call sort of reactive bioethics, where,
Okay.
oh my gosh, there's this big development, nobody knew this was coming, nobody had a heads up, what are we supposed to do about it? And to really be more embedded ethics, where we actually know what's coming down the pike and we're giving advice. So there's if certainly if this kind of technology was being developed at Stanford, and possibly even if it was being developed by industry, there's a chance that the people involved in some of these technologies may have reached out already to me, or certainly to one of my colleagues who I might know, to be like, what are the ethical issues that we should be thinking about as we're developing it? Because one of the challenging things about ethics, and this is actually really important for understanding the public response, science tends to proceed incrementally, and we can maybe look down the road with this more science fiction technology, but from the point of view of the technology developers, they're just following one foot in front of the other, and like, we did this step, then we did the next step, then we did the next step, and from their point of view, the point where it suddenly becomes this huge social issue is kind of often surprising to the scientists, because they were just taking the next logical step down the road that they were already going down. And by now it's already too late to change paths very easily, and everybody's freaking out. And so what we've learned is it's really better if before you walk down the path, you start to think through, like, where is this going? What are the issues just for each step themselves? But also more broadly, are there some landmines that we should be wary of, so that by the time you cross that boundary, that the public starts freaking out, the answer from the scientists are, here are a bunch of ethicists who've already thought through some of these issues. We have thought through these issues with these ethicists, so we have good answers for how to think about some of the problems and challenges, and so that this isn't coming from nowhere. One of the very first efforts in that regard was in synthetic biology, where before synthetic biology even existed as a field, and before anything, even a virus, had actually been synthesized, Craig Venter recognized that something like that would likely raise some concerns, and a group of us spent a year and a half thinking through the ethical issues in synthesizing a minimal genome. We published a paper in Science along with a paper they did, and then a couple of years later, when the first virus was actually synthesized, and about a decade later, when the first actual organism, a bacterial organism, was actually synthesized, we already had this whole literature and a whole body of work thinking through what all the issues were, what the problems were, how to address that, how to empirically explore whether there are any things that we hadn't anticipated, processes to be put in place, and so on. So I think that's the goal, is not just to be able to talk to CNN about it, but when you talk to CNN, to say, don't panic. We had a towel when so it's okay. So we sort of knew what we were doing. So with that in mind, assuming that the researchers were reaching out to me, I'm going to ask that instead of CNN. The researchers out to me about some of the things in the areas you talked about. I mean, who are the researchers? How serious are they? Is this real science or pseudoscience? They're all questions. But usually, if I'm talking to legitimate scientists who are doing really important work, there are a whole set of things that you would look at. Are you the first big cut? Like about half of the technologies you mentioned are aiming at producing a live child.
Mhm.
and about half of them are not. And so that's the first really big cleavage point, right? Because there's a huge difference between the issues that arise in what you called it therapeutic cloning. I hate that terminology because until you actually have a treatment, it's not necessarily therapeutic.
Sure.
And so it can be misleading to the oocyte donors or embryo donors to think that it's definitely therapeutic when we haven't crossed that boundary yet. So, which is one of the reasons why I helped design our California human stem cell guidelines so that we don't allow that usage in any of
Okay.
parts of California. But anyway, but research uses of embryos, or if you're using CRISPR for research purposes on cells, where you're not actually attempting to produce a live birth, those are all the first sort of cleavage, because there are ethical issues in both, but they're pretty different. In
Mhm.
the situations where you're doing something like He did in China, where he was trying to create CRISPR babies,
Right.
or other technologies were actually using the technology to create an actual child. Then there's a whole framework for evaluating what's being done, or actually several frameworks. Part of that framework is just the implementation of actual regulatory thought about this. So the common rule says, here's ways of thinking about this. And so you would look at issues like, are the risks reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits? Do you have adequate informed consent? And sort of those are risks minimized as much as possible. So those are all some of the framing issues that really come from the regulatory system that really let you to really zero down and really think through whether or not it's ready. Moreover, if it's a really brand new cutting edge technology, there's actually some frameworks around innovation that are relevant, including what's the institutional field strength like? Is this the right place to be doing it? Do they have all the relevant expertise? What's the ethical climate of the institution? Do they have all the right kinds of oversight and considerations in the oversight for this, for implementing it? For innovation, you'd want to make sure there's been public discourse, both among professionals in the field and in the broader public, before you cross any of these kinds of boundaries.
Mhm.
So those are some of the kinds of considerations that you would look at as well. Now, when you look at that, is a great example. When you look at each of those elements,
Mhm.
none of those were met in the research that he was proposing. Risks weren't reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, because at least some of those embryos were known to be very unlikely to produce the benefits that he was aiming at. One was a heterozygote, so it was unlikely to be beneficial. And risks weren't minimized because it was already known that there were off-target mutations which were likely to, or had a reasonable chance to potentially be harmful. So risks weren't reasonable in relation to the benefits. Risks weren't minimized as much. If you look at the informed consent forms, parents did not have adequate information or understanding that was disclosed to them, so you didn't have adequate informed consent. Nobody knew that he was transgressing these boundaries, so you didn't meet the standards of sort of public discussion. He didn't have anything like the equivalent of IRB approval, so you didn't have the institutional climate of the institution wasn't adequate or adequately dealt with. You didn't have appropriate oversight of it. So you can sort of go through each of those elements and see ways in which all of these different pieces that were required were missing from that. And that's essentially what the kind of thing is. You go through several different checklists that we have that we can go through with research to say, if you're doing something innovative, I'd want to make sure you meet all four of Franny Moore's requirements. You have to meet all the regulatory requirements if you want to do that, as well as the ethical theories from the Belmont report that are behind that. So there's lots of things like that. There are a few things that might have arisen that are specific to particular areas.
Mhm.
There are recommendations and general consensus guidelines that you'd want to go through to make sure those are met as well. And then you would just say, go and tell them, you need to make sure you're doing this, and this. And we do things like that all the time. When is the right time to try a trial to develop a uterus transplant? When is the right time to try to actually do CRISPR on an embryo? When is the right time to try and produce a baby from a CRISPRed embryo? Not now is the answer to the
Right.
last question. But what kind of evidence would you need to do that? So, and when would it be ready? And when do you hit the sort of what sometimes called the prime time problem? When is it ready, technology ready
Mhm.
for prime time? And what are the guideposts that we tend to look at for knowing when you've hit that boundary? Some of those are really tough calls.
Sure.
I remember I've both written about and then later been asked to make essentially regulatory decisions about some very cutting edge technologies. And, it's tough to be sitting there on the front lines where you're having to sort of say, especially as like a member of the IRB, say, thumbs up, thumbs down to this piece of technology being tried in a human that's never been put in a human before. Is it really ready for prime time? But ultimately, if you have the frameworks in place and you've sort of pushed the investigators to give good answers to all the questions that you raise, so that you say, this seems plausible and the people with the relevant expertise think that these standards have been met, well, then that's when it's time to say that, it's time to go forward and see if it works, as long as you've got adequate informed consent.
An outstanding response. Yeah, there's so much to think about there, but I really appreciate the detail you went into with that, especially for some of these real world examples like in China and so forth. So that was spot on. Moving on to the next basket, which I call improvement of the human condition. And I guess in the center of that, we'll throw on the table sort of the various we'll put right to try sort of on the table as a recent legislative initiative, but then of course sort of expanded access and various other U.S. related programs for either unapproved or experimental medicinal access for no option patients. So they've played that in the middle. On one hand, now we have things happening outside the United States, whether that be conditional approval of stem cell therapies at phase 2 in Japan, or some of the really unique stuff that's going on in China now with regard to their free zone activity. I mean, a couple of years ago, they announced that Merck, fifth largest drug company in the world, was actually undertaking a form of pharmaceutical tourism on this small island off the coast of southern China. So we have very unique models occurring outside of the United States. And then I guess alongside this right to try model are other forms of, let's just say, do-it-yourself, biotech, biohacking, the phenomenon on the West Coast of this microdosing of hallucinogens for neural enhancement. A lot of stuff out there, that all sort of swims in this same pool of, there's something there. It might not be approved for it. It's experimental, but I want to try it today. Take your time and just give us your views on this space and how, once again, you approach this from the perspective, say that, the patient that wants something today, whether it's for enhancement or whether it's to save their life.
Yeah, I think of those as very different sets of issues. So let me first start with the right to try issues and the transplant tourism issues, which I think those two are different, but they're related.
Okay.
I have to say the right to try law at the federal level and some of the state laws that have come into place, I think are, especially the federal level, where that legislation is deeply, deeply misguided. In fact, I joined a lot of bioethicists in an amicus curiae brief to Congress opposing that legislation. For one thing, it doesn't do what people think it does. It really isn't a right to try. It's a right to ask. Mm-hmm. Because in the end, I mean, the FDA, people are worried about the FDA as an obstacle to these things, but the FDA approved over 99% of the expanded access or compassionate use requests. And they did so fairly quickly with a very simple one-page form. So it's not like the FDA was really a major hurdle or obstacle to doing it. However, about, I think it's 15% of the time, they did make recommendations back saying, here's something you can do to make this better and more safe for the people you're giving it to. And now we're going to lose that 15% of use of compassionate uses where actually people may be harmed because they're in this race, they may not be doing things as well as they could, and we're missing those extra set of eyeballs. Okay. So I think that's problematic. But it also, nobody wants to be the bad guy to say that there's nothing more that works. Mm-hmm. But the FDA always says yes. The states keep saying we should do this. Now it's made the companies be in the bad position that they have to be the bad guys of saying no to people. There are a lot of reasons to being very concerned about this. There's nothing wrong with compassionate use or expanded access programs for late phase trials. Something that the optimal case, you've gone through phase 3, the data looks very promising. There's enough of the drug available that the company can make it available to individuals. They set up a process where you have an expanded access program where individuals can, on a fair and just basis, apply to get access to it during that period while they're awaiting FDA approval. That is the optimal way in which an expanded access commercial work. Slightly less optimal, but still potentially valuable, is a similar expanded access program that happens, say, at the end of phase 2, where you haven't actually shown for sure that it works, but these are desperate people. There's nothing else that's offered. The safety profile, it looks good enough that the company feels comfortable going forward and doing this, and then you create an expanded access program at that point. That also seems doable. But there are several reasons why I think we should generally be concerned about these expanded access programs. So one is that having the companies put a lot of effort into them and deal with and especially with social media now, people are following even very early phase 1 trials or even preclinical work that looks promising, and if there's no therapy, and the companies are being inundated by requests. And if you put a lot of effort into that basket, what you're not doing is putting a lot of effort into the basket of actually developing the therapy itself and getting it approved so it can be given to actual patients therapeutically. And so it's really important that we don't allow those things to stop the process of going forward with actually making the drug happen available. The second problem is, especially with compassionate use, it is often highly unequal in terms of access. It's people who have a really good social media presence, people who are attractive in one way or another. So rather than a fair process like expanded access programs at least often try to have, it's often based on like, here's an individual, the company said no, and then there's a social media campaign for this one individual, but why this individual and not the 100 other patients who also would like to have access to the drug? And then the company sort of gives into pressure, gives them access to it, and then goes back to the work of seeing whether this drug really works and can be approved. A third problem, especially when you get to the early phases, is that people don't understand how unlikely it is that these interventions are really going to work. There's a lot of magic thinking that these things are going to be better than they really are or more likely to work, especially given the record of recent oncology development. When it actually gets approved on the, most likely it won't even get approved. But if it actually does turn into an approved indication and approved therapy, the most likely outcome is going to be something that, gives you 2 more months of life for $120,000 or something. That's what we see in drug after drug, and only when used in other things. But there's just thinking that this is going to be this magic bullet when the record in oncology, it's not that there aren't some exceptions that work amazingly well, but the record just isn't there for most things. Now there are exceptional areas, the treatments for spinal muscular atrophy, some of the, which were just dramatic results. Those do happen, but I can tell you the community was pushing really hard to enroll as many people as they could who meet the inclusion criteria. And then they had an expanded access program the minute they finished the phase 3 and had everybody in. After people were enrolled in the trial, they went straight to opening up to expanded access, and the FDA rushed it, and in 4 months it was approved. Had FDA approval. And then the next big thing for that, and that's what they're dealing with now with the gene therapy for SMA, is trying to get payers and getting insurance companies to pay for it. That's been the challenge. So I just think there's a lot of I see a lot of magic thinking. If you're dying and there's nothing that works, there's this temptation to just think that the next thing is going to be the magic bullet that cures me, when that really is very unlikely. And it's really, and there's a reason why we need to go the route of doing the clinical work, of the clinical research, to really see whether this thing really works. When you get further down the road where it really does look like it works and where the burdens outweigh the benefits and it really is net beneficial, when you cross that boundary, then having a fair process where people can apply through an expanded access program makes sense. But if you really want to not detract from the company's efforts, because they all have, especially for the smaller companies, they only have so many dollars to devote to their efforts, then the government should pay for it. So if the feds, if you really want a real expanded access program and a real right to try, then the government should actually pay the companies for those expanded access programs. One of the big controversial cases came about because a company that had a very promising drug, they had a large expanded access program funded by the Department of Defense for a while. When that ended, they went back to trying to put their efforts into trying to get the drug approved. And then a child who couldn't get compassionate use caused a big controversy that and it can get quite vicious. In that case, the CEO was getting death threats and wound up having to resign from the company. And yet there were 100 other patients who didn't get it, but weren't didn't have the social media campaign. So those are all my concerns about expanded access. So I think on the whole, or right to try laws, I think expanded access is very valuable. I think there are occasions when compassionate use as a one-off and an N of one trial can make sense as well, but we have to be very careful about them and not allow them to derail the broader efforts to develop safe and effective drugs that can be used for everybody, and to make sure that the process is relatively just in the way in which these goods are allocated. So that's sort of how I think about that. And similarly, I say the same thing about and I think most of the bioethics community is in agreement about that, about how they think about it. Might have some value, but the right to try laws may be misguided as a way of even achieving the goals that the proponents have. Now one area where compassionate use and right to try makes more sense to me, and this relates to the transplant tourism, if you've got something that has met regulatory requirements in other countries and is being used therapeutically elsewhere, and there can be lots of reasons why they're not available in the US. A drug that I remember a case I was involved in where a drug that had one time been approved in the FDA, but for a lot of reasons, the intramuscularly injected version of that drug was just not as popular as the PO, the oral version of the drug, and they let their approval lapse, and so it was no longer available in the US. But it was available in Europe intramuscularly, and we had a patient who needed this drug, but for a lot of reasons couldn't take it orally. And so we needed an IM administration. This is a safe, effective drug that's approved in another country. That's a perfect example of a great use of compassionate use where, of course, it should be done. So if you've got something that's got approval elsewhere, basically you're really looking, what's the evidence of the efficacy? And so if you're thinking about this in terms of framework, it's really all about what's the nature of the evidence, what are the burdens and the benefits in the trade-off between this, what are the justice considerations around access and who has access to it. Those are sort of all the sort of things that you're thinking about as you're sort of evaluating on a case-by-case basis whether or not this makes sense as a particular example of something that should be used going forward. A lot of the same principles in expanded access programs for who should get access are very similar to the principles involved in organ transplant allocation issues. And so, and in fact, there's been a lot of overlap. Art Kaplan, who's done a lot about organ transplant, is also, his group has done a lot at NYU about expanded access programs and compassionate use programs. And I think it draws very heavily on the way we think about allocation of scarce resources. If you only have so much of a drug to go around during that expanded access phase, because you're going to be most of it for your clinical trials, how should you allocate that in a just manner is not very dissimilar from how we allocate organs. And so we use the same principles and some of the same considerations in allocating those two and evaluating potential candidates. So we have a just, fair approach that also maximizes benefits, minimizes harms, but does so in a just way. So while taking into account the considerations that we talked earlier about things like rescue, all those other kinds of considerations and justice that we care about in developing systems of allocation. So that's sort of how I think about those issues. The other example that you mentioned and raised was biohacking. I think that's a very different kind of issue. Biohacking, and in general, it's a very interesting era. So the democratization of science in different ways is very, very interesting, and it's very exciting in some ways, but it is very scary in others. Sure. So the advantages, so biohacking is clearly one sort of extreme example of that, where especially when you're hacking yourself, but also things like gamification research. I don't know if you're familiar with Foldit or Eterna or iWire or any of these other efforts. Okay. So it's really interesting technology, and I think that's something that may wind up leading to a lot more efforts in that area. It's people are really good computers. Sure. So what happened was researchers at University of Washington were working on studying protein folding patterns and trying to understand how proteins fold, and to have enough computing power to do the work that they were doing, they had a program where they could borrow computing time from people, and in exchange for that, you got a screensaver that would show the machine trying to solve the problem. And people who were not scientists, who were just looking at the screen, got really frustrated because they could start to figure out what it was trying to do, and they were like, it doesn't see that it's stuck this way, and if it just did this, it would do what it's trying to do. And when the researchers realized that people were figuring this out, they created a game called Folded, where players could actually figure out folding patterns by playing this game without ever having to know a lot of biology. And it wound up in a week of doing that. They figured out how a simian version of HIV folded that people had been working on for 10 years.
Wow.
And so Folded has been really this huge development. People here at Stanford have something called Eterna, where there's this huge game for designing RNA molecules to do different kinds of things. In those kinds of games, it's usually just the very elite players that really have a big role, and they actually turned over part of their lab to say the elite players will pick what things will synthesize and will create whatever RNAs get the best design score from the best elite players, and then see if they work. And it's not just that they solve these particular problems, they also figure out like cookbooks, like what are the tricks that make them figure this out, and then the researchers design better algorithms so that the computers get better, and there's this constant going back and forth where the computers get smarter and better because they've learned from all these players playing this game, and then the game players get better, and there's this constant back and forth to make things better. And occasionally you even have cases where new principles of like a disabled autistic player of Eterna in the Netherlands figured out some features of things that worked really well, looked good, and also really did what they were supposed to do. And in doing that, figured out a new principle of RNA biology without necessarily having to know a lot of science. I was just actually at something called EternaCon, and it was actually pretty impressive how these non-scientist game players, how incredibly sophisticated, even about science, they become. So even talk about genetics, they start to sound an awful lot like scientists, even though they're game players. Anyway, so but all of these are efforts at really democratizing science and and letting broader public really engage in it. And it's powerful and it's great, but there are risks that we need to really think about in all of this. Our current system, which evolved over hundreds of years and really emerged in the 17th century, of what it means to be a scientist. You know, in the 17th century, when the idea of a scientific article was first created, before that, you knew you could trust the science because it took place in a theater and you observed the experiment yourself. The idea of an article as virtual witnessing hinged on the trustworthiness of the people who were doing it. And we've developed, for hundreds of years, we've developed a set of norms and oversight and regulation, and we've had failures and the development of new norms and guides and regulations and protections to really address professional science. When you go outside of that to democratize, to have non-professional scientists actively engage in these kinds of activities, you lose some of those norms and protections. And when you lose some of those norms and protections, you don't have to. And there are some folks who are trying to make sure to bring things back in that way. Some of the game players in some of these games are being employed by institutions, by scientists. They're being employed, which means they have to go through the same kind of training for research integrity and other things that scientists have to go through, even though they're game players. But others do not have that, and there's all kinds of worries and challenges about how to think about those protections. In the case of biohackers, you know, all the rules and protections of human subjects research that we've developed over this time, you know, this is a community that's outside of the common rule. They're an unregulated activity in which the rules don't apply. Some of them will like that way of thinking about it. They like the disruptive aspects of it and thinking about that way. And there's some good things to it, but there are potentially huge negative consequences to that. And I think we haven't done a really great job. There's also the potential for exploitation, because after all, a lot of these are formally paid activities. Mm-hmm. And or you find yourself doing free labor for other people, that can also be a challenge. So there's lots of very interesting literature and ethics being developed right now that's pretty cutting edge in ethics about how to think about all of these sorts of activities and the ethics of all of these kinds of activities.
I have to also point my kids in the direction of the biomedical gaming, because they can take care of
They're not on mobile, you know, it's on a computer. They're not, I mean, it really is an interesting thing because it's like a pyramid. Most people, I tried to get my wife, who loves Candy Crush obsessively, plays with Candy Crush all the time. I tried to get her to start to do some of this. She was playing iWire, which is a neuro mapping game. And it's like, it just doesn't cut it compared to Candy Crush. And it's like, so a lot of people might try and drop out. So it's a relatively small number, but still in the order of many thousands of people play it obsessively and get really good at it, and they're the ones who really drive the science.
Let's segue now to the last basket, which I'll call end of life. And this is, of course, involves issues that you are involved in on a daily basis, from palliative care, advanced healthcare directives, organ transplantation. Of course, you talked a bit about that. But at the same time, obviously, a lot of new issues arising on your desk. You know, last year at the Harvard Medical School, the Bioethics conference in 2018 had to do with the 50-year anniversary of the Harvard report on brain death. The Jahi McMath case was something center stage there. We're in an interesting era where we're learning quite a bit about the borders of life and death, from what we're learning, the recent study at Yale University on the pig brains that were brought back to life, the work that's happening on the so-called
Brains were brought back to life, cells were brought back to life.
Cells, yeah. The thanatotranscriptomic stuff about all these genes that we're finding out that spark to life after we're dead. And then, of course, Alan Schumann and Calista Machado, wrote this paper adamantly, saying that this was not brain death. This was a new state of deep coma. A lot of stuff happening. Take us once again, as you will, through sort of what we're looking at in terms of the issues with end of life, the issues that you deal with, but some of this new stuff too that's happening on a daily basis.
Yeah. So I would say first a shout on the stuff coming out of Yale. A shout out. That's a good example of bringing in an ethicist to work on as they're working on it. Steve Latham at Yale is the bioethicist who's been working as part of that team. So there was an actual JD, PhD working ethicist who was one of the authors of their Nature paper, and so they absolutely brought that in and have been working on it as they sort of gone along. So that's a good illustration. I would say the issue of brain death is really complicated, and I think that the thing that's important to recognize. This is going to get into. I'm going to just touch on this very briefly because it gets into deep philosophical waters. Mm-hmm. That has to do with the nature of how we taxonomize and develop our classification systems in science. Mm-hmm. The periodic element, the table, might be an exception, but with possibly that exception, there are relatively few classification systems that we use in biology, much less medicine, that actually carve nature at the joints and correspond to the nature of reality. And I aren't really thought to do that. Like, there's some debate about whether species concepts really work, but if you really delve into it, it's pretty implausible that they really map onto the way we develop these ways of organizing things because they work to achieve very practical goals that are very local and have to be done. Medicine, this is even clearer. The nosology, the taxonomic system we use for dividing diseases are very much conventionally made to achieve certain purposes, and they have a history to them. Some of our diseases we define by clusters of signs and symptoms. Other diseases we define by the cause of the disease. So we call the flu influenza after, and we classify it as influenza after the cause of the disease. Then there are other diseases that we classify by the actual signs and symptoms. So we don't have a coherent system completely. There's a history to each disease thing that winds up entering in, and we just sort of fiddle with it and figure it out till we get something that works. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It works for medicine. It works for science. It's a perfectly fine way to go. The idea that life and death, as we intuitively understand it in what I will call folk medicine, the kind of common sense or folk biology, the language that we commonly use, the idea that that would map onto something that would be easily defined and would carve nature at the joints was probably, anybody who thought that would be possible was extremely naive about how medicine and science work. And so it's important to note that when we decide that we want to draw the line between life and death, that decision as a medical matter is going to be conventionally defined and have to just work to do the job it's intended to do, in the same way that calling something the flu rather than calling everybody who's nauseated having the same disease has to do its work, right?
Mhm.
So it just has to play a role and do something. As a line, it works very well. It's very well defined. There's not really very clear exceptions. It's possible people have speculated that Jahi McMath might have been an exception. We don't really have good reason to believe that that's true. There's nobody who's a qualified neurologist who ever examined her and found her to be anything other than brain dead.
Mhm.
The only people who said something to the contrary did so on the basis of observed videotapes that were, out of context. You can't make a diagnosis that way. So nobody ever evaluated, even Schumann, who who does not believe in brain death and who tried to say that the patient was not, and tried to make a diagnosis based on these videos. Schumann, when he actually examined the patient, found her to meet the criteria for brain death. So I think there's no reason right now to give up the criteria that have been developed by neurology, which seem to work really well. The community has very close to consensus about the fact that the line works really well. It's a good drawing line. And in terms of the things that we really care about, what we have to have a line that plays certain social roles and functional roles. When are you no longer married? When is your spouse single? When do you no longer have a credit card bill? When does a will take effect so that you can start to divvy up assets? There's all these death behaviors, what Bob Beach has called these death behaviors, that have to come into play.
Mhm.
And when is the appropriate time for that to come into play? Now, at a time when you have irreversibly lost everything that made you who you are in terms of your memories, your personality, and all of that is irreversibly lost, where we can say that definitively, high degree of accuracy with a good test that can be done in a timely way, seems like a line that works really well, and there's no real reason to give it up as a line. It's
Mhm.
well entrenched legally, and so that's how I look at it.
Mhm.
And there could be developments that cause us to rethink that, just like any other conventionally defined line. Just like ulcers were at one time defined one way, and then when we learned a lot more about them, we start
Sure.
to make fine-grained distinctions in different ways, and we develop our nosologies. So I think it's fine to think that it's open to changes, but right now there's not any reason to believe that we have much of a reason to do it. And given how much is built on it, including all of our organ procurement process, or almost all of our organ procurement process, I don't think there's really good grounds for really evaluating it. There's some legal complications, which I won't go into, and why I think it would make sense to redefine the Uniform Determination of Death Act to more
Okay.
accurately reflect neurological practice. Hasn't been really updated substantively in this way since the early 80s, and
Mhm.
things have changed since then. And so we know more now than we did then. And so there are changes that should be made on the basis of that. We now know that there is hormonal activity. There's some, we know that there's some pineal gland function,
Mhm.
some other things that go on even in patients who are brain dead. So we
Right.
probably accommodate that. Britain's done that. We should do it as well. So, but other than that, so I don't think that there's any reason to deal with that. The other thing I would say about this, and this is what some of my neurocritical care colleagues say, we see the same things about like we're not very good at diagnosing who's vegetative and who's not,
Mhm.
and who's in a minimally conscious state. But what they come back to is saying whether you're minimally conscious, vegetative, brain dead. I mean, the bottom line is the outcomes are going to be terrible, and the person who existed before has been lost.
Right.
Very, very few people think that is a quality of life worth living, or something that's really something that people would really want to have. And so a bigger question underlying this that I see as a ubiquitous problem that arises in end of life issues is the incredible problem of doing an adequate job of physicians communicating with patients or their families around issues around the end of life. And they do a terrible job. Every empirical study of that communication, including some of ours, have found the same thing. We've recorded goals of care conversations. Other people have done the same kind of research, and you find even people who are generally thought to be who think of themselves and who I would think of as pretty good at it,
Mhm.
these systemic problems when you actually record the conversations and look at it. Moreover, some of our research, we're starting to do research where we're using tools from linguistics and philosophy of language and linguistic anthropology to explore communication in a way that's never really been explored before. And we're starting to see some of why things go wrong and that hasn't really been adequately captured in the literature. Just to give you one example, this is a piece we published in both Critical Care Medicine was the empirical piece, and then we published a conceptual piece in Cambridge Quarterly. If I told you that your condition is treatable, what do you think it means when I tell you that your condition is treatable?
I'm going to have a viable therapeutic outcome from that treatment.
Yeah, that you think it's going to say something about your prognosis and good outcome. Turns out most physicians don't think that's what it means. So they think it means that they have something to do, some intervention to do that may or may not have very much of an impact on the outcome. Or the outcome that it might have an impact might be very narrow. So I realized this when I was in rounds one day, when we had a patient who had just been recently diagnosed with metastatic cholangiocarcinoma. And I said, do we know what their goals of care are? And they said, well, it's too early, it's still treatable. And I thought, I bet very few people would say treatable is compatible with the fact that there's only about an 8% chance of 5-year survival, which was true. Even though it makes sense actually to think about it, it was early diagnosis, so you'd want to do the surgery. There are things you'd want to do as a clinician, even though the chances of survival are very, very low at that point. So we studied this very systematically and did interviews with both patients and physicians about what it means, and we gave some scenarios, and we saw things that really explained a lot of other findings that exist in the literature about the fact that when patients hear people just use certain words to describe what's going on, including things like telling them that their condition has treatment or is treatable, they're making an inference about what the physician is intending to communicate, and they think they're trying to give them good news. Whereas the clinician thinks they're just saying something about something that they have, that there's something that they can do or that they would like to do, or maybe just could do, and maybe they're really even neutral about whether it's a good idea or not. And so you wind up getting these huge systematic disconnects between the messages between physicians and patients because of these inferences going awry about what's being communicated. And a fundamental aspect of language that's really important is while we spend a lot of our time focused on the literal meaning of the words that we use, most communication is really about the inferences that people make and the things that are indirectly communicated and not the literal meaning of the words. Do you know what time it is?
8 p.m.
That's an example, right? So I asked you a question, and instead of giving an answer, the answer would be either yes or no. Either you know what time it is or you don't know what time it is. You told me what time it is because you made an inference that by asking that question, I was making a request and would want to know what the time is. Absolutely. So that's a ubiquitous feature. Can you go to the party? I have to work. Right? It's a non sequitur. If you record conversations, they're really streams of non sequiturs put together by inferences people are making that are contextual and not semantic in origin and not really about meaning. So we are starting to really study this in a systematic way that has not really been studied very much before, to try and find ways of improving communication between patients and physicians so that end-of-life care might be better, because you might avoid a lot of these kinds of more interesting philosophical debates, but they might go away if we just did a better job of communicating.
Sure. It's clearly a fascinating road that I don't really think about that people are involved in, but the fact that you're doing the research is very impressive. We're getting to the point of the show where we wrap things up and we move away from sort of the general theme of the science and move a little over to the science fiction. And then we pose this question to all of our guests that join us. Clearly, you've met a lot of interesting people throughout your career and been involved in so many interesting cases and situations. I'm going to pose a question about someone who Dr. David Magnus would have liked to meet if you were around at some previous time, whether that be a scientist, a philosopher, a writer. If you had the opportunity to go visit that person in the hypothetical time machine over there, for Dr. David Magnus, who would that have been? And what would you have liked to spend time with that person talking about? You can take time to think about that one.
What an interesting question. Do I get to speak the language even though I don't speak it now? So
There's universal translator device.
Universal translator, so I can speak it. That's a tough one. I would say, just because it's not just about wanting to meet them and understand them, but also just because they're both stunningly brilliant, but also just seems like it would be really a good time to have with them. Like Newton is brilliant, but he does not seem like he would be a good time. I think would be Galileo.
Okay.
Galileo, brilliant, stood up for his convictions in different ways that I really admire. So I'd want to talk to him about that. But also, I could totally see hanging out and drinking with him and having just a really good time and having a great conversation over wine with him. So Galileo would be my choice for all those reasons. Brilliant. Some of the level of brilliance to really shift from a fundamentally Aristotelian physics
Sure.
to a first relativistic physics
Mhm.
is just brilliant, and so many other inventions and so many other things that he did that were so incredibly important and brilliant, while at the same time doing it in a context of high risk to himself, right? So that he had a lot of courage of his convictions. But while also seeming like a guy who'd just be really fun to hang out with. So Galileo's my guy.
There you go. Galileo. Perfect. Well, I just really want to thank you, for your opportunity to join us tonight, for really doing this major information dump for us and educating us on all these matters, and the fact that there are folks like you at the sort of the leading edge thought leaders on these matters as we transition into this 21st century world of all this new stuff that's coming down the pike. And we have to have the right minds like yours focusing on these things, and because they're coming fast and furious, and we have to have the right positions and answers, and really dissect, as you have done so thoroughly throughout this conversation, each issue as it comes along. So really, thank you so much in not just joining us, but in all the work that you do and continue to do on these matters. And for everyone listening, once again, it's been Dr. David Magnus, Thomas A. Raffin Professor of Medicine and Biomedical Ethics and Professor of Pediatrics at Stanford University. Really an amazing thought leader in an amazing evolving area of the biomedical and philosophical sciences. Thank you so much again for taking the time tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Our pleasure.